Hello, and welcome to the public launch of the Polar Institute's Arctic Infrastructure Inventory. I'm Mike Sfraga, the director of the Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program. I once again want to extend my appreciation for the incredible support we receive from A2A Railway and Algunic Corporation from Wainwright, Alaska. Without them, we could not hold important policy-focused discussions or advance efforts like you will hear about today. About a year and a half ago, Jack Durkee and I met with our colleagues at Guggenheim Partners to discuss the future of their Arctic inventory. Over the course of several months, we discussed the possibility of transferring that inventory to the Wilson Center. And then a few months later, with the support of President Grimson, Scott Minerd, the chairman of investments and global CIO of Guggenheim Partners, and I announced at the 2019 Arctic Circle Assembly the formal transfer of the inventory to the center. We had a vision that the inventory would be far more than a list of projects. We envisioned a larger, interactive, and ever-growing web-based and publicly available database that would become the foundation for research, enhance and inform policymaking, support sustainable economic development, and serve the broader Arctic community. Within 24 hours of that announcement, we met with the leadership of the Arctic Economic Council, and I want to thank the AEC for their immediate and continued support. No matter which Arctic issue you choose to discuss, climate change, community security, civil security, national homeland security, local and regional economic development, international trade, social justice, the development and implementation of policies, the conversation almost always turns to the need for a broad range of basic or specialized infrastructure. We have all been in our share of meetings where the following questions have been asked. Where can we find out more about infrastructure in the Arctic? What types of infrastructure exist and where? What's planned and why? Who's building this infrastructure? Who's funding this infrastructure? And so on. The Arctic Infrastructure Inventory is a tool with the promise of answering and addressing some, if not all, of these questions over time. And speaking of questions, we hope that you will engage with us throughout this dialogue by emailing your questions to polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. Like all things, the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory has a history. And this history began several years ago with Scott Minerd of Guggenheim Partners and Mead Treadwell and others as part of a set of discussions at the World Economic Forum. So it's a pleasure to introduce Mead Treadwell, the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of Alaska, the former chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and co-chair of the Polar Institute, to provide his perspectives on those early discussions and the continued need for a more sustainable infrastructure in the North and the value of having an Arctic infrastructure inventory publicly available to support activities throughout the region. With that, it's a pleasure to turn over the microphone to my friend and colleague, Mead Treadwell. Mead, good morning and thank you.
Mike, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here with the others on the program and the others listening. Hey, Mike, just to start, I'd like to dedicate my remarks today to the memory of Lee J. Cho. Dr. Lee J. Cho was head of the East-West Center, caught COVID and died very, very quickly. And for the past, many of the past 25 years, Dr. Cho was working with Alaskans, with Asian economic leaders on the idea of Northeast Asia infrastructure. And I can't tell you how glad I was that he included former Governor Steve Cooper and me in the Arctic discussion. And we were just, there's several folks at Wilson who've been involved in those discussions. And so I dedicate my remarks to the memory of somebody who worked hard to bring us together to finance infrastructure. What I want to say today, and Scott Minerd, first to thank Scott for his support for this program, to thank one of my companies, Alberta and Alaska Railway, for their support of this program and this effort. When we started to work on this at the World Economic Forum, we sat down and said, you know, the Arctic is an emerging market. It's an emerging market for investment, and it's going to be a big sponge. There is a lot of money that will have to come in. The 4 million people who live in the Arctic just don't have enough money in their mattresses to cover our infrastructure needs, whether it's for new ports, whether it's for icebreakers, whether it's for the basic sanitation that we need in rural parts of the world, whether it's for new energy projects. And that there's three things that we started at the World Economic Forum that we felt would be very, very important. First was a bit of an educational effort with other members of the forum, a very influential group, on the imperative of looking at the Arctic with reality. It's not just a snow globe, as Senator Murkowski likes to say. It's a place where people live, and we were very actively supporting activity around the world, whether it's trade, transportation, minerals, energy, food, and sustainable development. The second thing we did is we published a set of principles for investment in the Arctic, and we asked people to sign up to those principles. And that program is now housed at the Arctic Economic Council. Hyder and Gail, who will be speaking today, are parts chair and members of that council, and we thank them for doing that. And then the third thing, as Scott Meinert said at the time when we launched this program last year, we wanted to move the inventory to an independent place, because this was not to be seen as a list of projects that any of us, particularly in the private sector, were promoting, but a dispassionate look from the Wilson Center about what is the inventory here. And in an emerging market, I'll just tell you, whether it's Africa, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Latin America, or whether it's the Arctic, the one thing that characterizes an emerging economy is not only large growth internally, but draw on investment externally to help get the infrastructure to build the economy. And we certainly have that. The large sources of capital in the world, we also said this last year when we launched this, are seeking infrastructure development, basically because infrastructure returns are more solid these days than, say, government bonds. And you're seeing a lot of portfolios. My colleague Gail Schubert here used to head the Alaska ARM board, which was our state pension fund. And they have to look at liquidity, they have to look at security. And when you look at big funds like that around the world, developing secure infrastructure finance opportunities is actually a very big thing for them and a very big thing for us. So, Mike, what I really want to do is, one, congratulate you and the Wilson Center for moving this forward. You, Jack Durkee, Taylor, many of the others who've worked on it or have been doing incredible work. I want people to know that this is a resource for this emerging market. We have lots of investment debate in the Arctic going along, and we also have to do what we have to do is take that sponge and go see where we can soak up a little bit of money so we can build the ports, build the icebreakers, build the energy projects, build the railroads. And people need to know and trust that the context of their investment is solid. And this is something that will be very, very helpful to the people of the Arctic. So I'm going to end with one word, Mike. Congratulations.
Well, Mead, thank you very much. That's very generous. It's a wonderful team effort. And thank you for the perspective on all of this. I think it's important, and a lot of the themes that you've touched on, I think, will come up here today. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Jack Durkee.
Great, thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Jack Durkee, and I am the Program Associate with the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. As part of my duties, I manage the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory, among other strategic initiatives. I'm excited to speak to you all virtually today to unveil the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory for the first time. My comments today will touch upon four main points. First, to explain what the inventory is, its intended audience, and what we've done to date to build the inventory's foundation. Second, to explain our vision for the larger Polar Institute program on Arctic economic development anchored around the inventory. Third, to briefly describe the inventory's genesis with Guggenheim partners. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, to exhibit the inventory itself. Before getting started, I'd like to note at the outset of my presentation that while today's launch is certainly momentous and the culmination of more than a year's work building the inventory's foundation, there is a lot more work remaining. We decided to launch the inventory now to primarily get the information in the public and show users the utility of the project. We know you all will find use in this current iteration, but we also fully encourage you to provide feedback on the inventory, on gaps of information, on new sources of information, on research methods, and anything else you think can help the inventory better serve Arctic communities. It may be cliched, but I really see this inventory, especially in these first few phases of its development, as a collaborative effort with stakeholders in Arctic infrastructure. So keep that in mind today throughout today's event, that we're excited with the progress we've made to date, but even more excited with the potential for this inventory to grow. Lastly, I'd like to thank and acknowledge a few groups of people for their help in getting the inventory to this point. First, Wilson Center leadership and CEO Jane Harmon for providing institutional and financial support during the first phase of this project. They saw the value in the inventory and have been behind our efforts since day zero. Second, to my research team, Taylor Poole, Taylor Holzhauser, Bethany Johnson, and Michaela Stith, who have been indispensable and deserve full credit for building the inventory as you see today. And third, Interactive Strategies, the web design company who created the portal, and in particular, Alba Patel, Claire Gangopadhyaya, and Nate Mao. And related to this effort is the Wilson Center External Relations team, and in particular, Lauren Booth for getting the portal, as you see, up and running. So with that all said, let's get to it. The Arctic Infrastructure Inventory is a data set tracking infrastructure projects across the Arctic. We list all types of infrastructure from roads and municipal buildings to pipelines to research stations and more across all 8 Arctic countries, plus other near Arctic areas as applicable. We developed our own definition of the Arctic in consultation with Arctic industry, research, and government experts, which closely resembles the Arctic Mapping and Assessment Program's definition. A detailed explanation of our definition can be found on the criteria section of the inventory portal, which we'll preview later today. After the first round of data gathering, we now have over 8,000 infrastructure projects listed, up from an initial 900 entries 1 year ago. We have thousands of more entries slated for addition in the coming year as we continue to add known projects and identify new ones, so that 8,000 number that you see now will continue to rise. To date, we have exclusively used open source research via the internet to obtain the information. Taylor Poole, the inventory's technical lead, conceptualized and built a new Python-based approach that scrapes larger volumes of data from sources in a short time frame, thus making the research process much more efficient. At one point in the research process, we were gathering so much information that Google actually temporarily blocked us from using her method. And I say that to convey just how much information we have processed to get to this point in showing the inventory. Anyways, a more detailed explanation of our research methods used to date can be found in the methodology section of the inventory portal. Once again, we'll preview that later. In the future, we will integrate other research methods into our work, including contacting entities that work in or with Arctic infrastructure to submit information, while also continuing with the aforementioned digital approach. The intended audience of the inventory is any and all stakeholders in Arctic infrastructure and economic development, including policymakers at the local, regional, and national levels, industry and investors, researchers, community leaders, national security entities, and whomever else finds utility in the data set. The inventory, for example, can highlight for investors a cluster of small cap projects or provide a tool to have more informed legislation on infrastructure. It really is up to you how you want to use the inventory. One brief note, this inventory simply provides information and necessarily aligns with the Wilson Center's mission to provide nonpartisan policy analysis. It does not and will not recommend certain projects to invest in or otherwise opine on the feasibility of projects. It is in essence and explicitly a source of information. So to synthesize all of that into a brief description of what we've done so far to build the inventory, we've laid the building blocks in terms of information, methodology, internal cataloging procedures, and strategic direction for the overall inventory. Moving on to our vision for the larger Polar Institute program, in addition to the inventory standalone value, it will also serve as the anchor for more research, analysis, and programming on Arctic economic development. This program will have events ranging from small seminars like this one to multi-day conferences to workshops to private briefings, and other outreach initiatives. These will feature Wilson Center experts, government practitioners, international policymakers, industry leaders, and other key stakeholders, much like typical Polar Institute and Wilson Center programming. The program will also have an array of written publications ranging from long-form reports to op-eds, blog posts, to including regular updates about additions to the inventory. These written publications will communicate overall trends, particular projects, notable events, and other matters pertaining to Arctic economic development and infrastructure. It will have a Wilson Center Research Fellow dedicated specifically to Arctic economic development issues, and this person will work closely with me on building the inventory. Lastly, and something I'm personally excited to work on, the inventory will have a GIS feature to present the 8,000 plus projects in a visual and interactive manner, allowing users to sort the information chronologically and geographically. And for those of you who aren't familiar with GIS, it's essentially a very fancy Google Maps that you can overlay permafrost maps on, for example. You can toggle through different search features. It really is quite a powerful tool. Anyways, for example, we could provide a map, like I said, of where permafrost is thawing and overlay that with all the airstrips in that region. Or you could filter for pipelines and see how they've developed for over 25 years, for example, in the Arctic. We also intend to supplement this GIS feature with satellite imaging for each project as possible. So once both the inventory and the program are fully developed, we envision consistent updates to the inventory and the GIS feature with regular program to publications. It really resembles a mini Polar Institute in that sense. Before we jump to the inventory's history, I want to briefly share some tentative priorities for phase 2 of this initiative. Note that this right here is a prime opportunity to give us feedback on the initiative. Like I said, whether it's gap of information, alternative research methods, building the technical structure of the database itself, whatever you think can help improve the inventory. So tentative phase 2 priorities as of now include building and implementing the GIS feature, identifying new information sources and updating existing entries with more information, further building out the technical structure of the inventory, and beginning programmatic activities, including the events and publications. Now, the last section before we get to the inventory exhibition. The initial inventory was created by Guggenheim Partners in 2014, led by Scott Meidert and Michael Perkinson. They continuously updated the inventory through late 2018 up to about 900 projects, while simultaneously developing what eventually became the Arctic Investment Protocol, now housed within the Arctic Economic Council. Guggenheim kept this initial data set private, and in December 2019, they transferred this initial inventory to the Wilson Center, as Mead said, so that we could make it a public resource to better serve Arctic communities. The aforementioned vision is the Wilson Center's undertaking in order to fully amplify the issues of Arctic infrastructure and economic development. The inventory evolved in nature after its transfer to the Wilson Center. Naturally, we adjusted and redesigned the inventory to meet the broader goals and objectives of the Wilson Center. Guggenheim remains a committed and insightful and essential partner to the Wilson Center as we further develop the inventory. And I once again want to thank the Guggenheim leadership team for their continued support. Over to the exhibition of the inventory itself. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So just to give you all kind of context of where we are, this is the Polar Institute overall website. And what I will do now is navigate from this into the inventory and give a brief tour of the inventory itself and the overall portal so that you just have a bit more information and context of how to navigate through that. Anyways, overall Institute, what's Polar Institute website, you go down here to the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory session. This brings you to our Arctic Infrastructure Inventory page for the overall program. As I said before, we'll have events, we'll have publications, the GIS feature, all of that will be on this main page. And so you kind of see it built out a bit here. You see the events. We'll have other sections built out as we start to develop those aspects. But the inventory itself, to get to it, is this link right here. Just to note this link, it's arcticinfrastructure.wilsoncenter.org. This brings you to the actual portal itself, and this is it. So I understand it's a bit wet there, but anyways, so this is the overall portal for the inventory. You can scroll down here. You can break down each particular section for the type of infrastructure or that, but to get to the inventory, this is it. So this is the search portal. So all just about 8,000 projects that we currently have publicized are in this search feature. On the left-hand side over here, you'll see that we've got different search filters for countries, and we list those countries there. You've got the type of infrastructure, which I mentioned before. You can break that into a subtype too. And as we include more types of infrastructure as we build this inventory, we will add those to the database as well, and will be reflected in this feature. And we also break it down into cost as well. We will include future types of search filters as we build this, such as whether it's a completed project, whether it's planned, whether it's in progress of development. So like I said before, this is the first phase, a very important phase to get this up and running, but there's still a lot more to add to this. And so the inventory also can search by particular name as well. Going to each individual page, this brings you to the detail page of each individual project itself. And this is where you'll find all the details of the projects. We have a project description synthesized on our end by the research team from the information that we gather. You'll have the location here. In the future, this right here, this location is where the GIS feature will appear, and it'll take you to another website where you can filter through all of those different features on the GIS. Anyways, development type, you can see what type of infrastructure it is, where this location, the status, whether it's completed, et cetera, and the budget and cost. Just one note about this number, it is all in, it's been updated from whatever local currency is, whether it's euros or kroner or rubles up to US dollars and pegged at 2020 value. And that will be updated as the years go on. And the sources here. So this source is where we find all the information via our research methods. And so the information you see in the description on this side over here, we get from this source. And as we continue to learn more about these projects, we'll further develop the description. We'll add more sources to verify that we've got that as well. So let's go back and see a different example. Let's try this one. So this one's actually pretty built out as well. You see the description, you see all the different details of the project as well, and the source as well. I'm trying to find one. Let's go to this one, for example. So like I said, still fairly new in our development of this inventory. There will be cases where you see project pages that list this amount of information. This is just so that we can get the projects onto the inventory. So we know that we need to do more research on this moving forward. So in the coming weeks, months, and years, as we learn more about these projects, these pages that have less information will be fully built out. So I just want to note that at the outset that you may encounter some pages like this in the initial phase of this project. Cool. So that's the inventory portal itself. Over to the different tabs up here. The About section and the glossary are fairly standard, just to show these to you. Describes the inventory, shows the team, our partners as well. Fairly straightforward. The glossary also is fairly straightforward, just describes and defines the different terms that we use in the inventory. And then over to the criteria and the methodology. So the criteria is, these are the parameters by which projects are included in the inventory. Whether the inventory is exhaustive, all these different questions kind of help us standardize what particular project we can admit into the inventory. For example, if one doesn't have sufficient information, we can't do that and just use these as kind of the guide. Before I referenced the definition of Arctic, that is right here. I would leave it up for you all to read, but please navigate to this website as well for the more information about that as well. And then just like I said, is the exactly that, the criteria to admit projects into the inventory. We may add or edit certain criterion as the inventory evolves. So this definitely is a work in progress as well, but certainly suffices where we are in the project. The methodology, as I mentioned before, is exactly that. It lists out our research methods to date in fairly technical detail. So if you all are interested in the methods that we used, particular sources right here, how we extracted the data, validated it, etc. There's more information on this page that I would encourage you to check out. This methodology section will be expanded when we start other research methods, like I mentioned before. So this, like all the pages in the inventory, will also obviously evolve moving forward. Let's see if there's anything else. I think that's pretty much everything that I've got to say today. Mike, over back to you. No, actually not over to Mike. So with the end of that section, and like I said, if there are any questions about the inventory, what we've done to date, if you have any comments, concerns, constructive criticism, please let us know. Like I said, this is a really important time for us in the inventory as we start to build it out in terms of the content and the technical structure and our methodology. So please reach out to us to give us feedback. You can reach out to us at polar@wilsoncenter.org. And we'll be happy to speak with you about your criticism or feedback about this. So thank you. Moving on to the next portion of today's event will be a conversation with Alice Rogoff, the co-chair of the Polar Institute Advisory Committee and publisher of Arctic Today, and Haider Gudjonsson, the chair of the Arctic Economic Council. You can find more information about their backgrounds on the website, but I will turn it over to you, Mike, to kick up the conversation.
Great, Jack. Thank you very much. You went over a lot of information in a short period of time. And thank you and the team for putting this together. I think you noted that when we first received the inventory, there were about 900 projects in there. And so to take it to 10-fold is significant, and giving it some context and putting some flesh on those bones. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this today, even though this is not totally completed yet in terms of our vision, is that we could wait a very long time and have everything completely done, or we can get it out to the community as soon as possible. So again, to reiterate what Jack has said, this is the very first initial stage of bringing 900 infrastructure projects to 8,000, knowing full well we've identified many thousands more, and we'll just start filling this out as we go along. A big component of this will be the input we receive from the Arctic community as we go forward. There were many people who helped inform what you just saw. We had a very, very wonderful team work with us on building out at least the framework for this. So I just want to keep reiterating, this is going to be an organic effort going on, hopefully for years, to continue to build and add value to something like the Arctic inventory infrastructure. And we will discover projects that we do not yet know. We'll discover equities that other populations have, and we will discover utility for this as we go forward. Speaking of that, there's one, we can either have scholarship on economic development, we can talk about economic development, and we can build tools to support economic development and community security and a whole list of other things. But it's the action part that many of us are really interested in. How do we move investment north? How do we create environments for viable economic development? How might a tool like the inventory provide at least one tool in our toolkit to grow the Arctic that we collectively envision? And so to provide some insight into that, we've invited both Haider and Alice to talk a little bit more about their work, their vision, and might assist individual or organizations, industry, or public policy makers throughout the North. So I would like to now turn it over to Haider and then Alice to talk for the next 10 or 15 minutes with me about their thoughts about Arctic infrastructure investment and development in the North, and perhaps the role and utility of the inventory. Haider, let's first start with you, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and congratulations to the Wilson Center and all the people. I think this is of tremendous importance. We at the Arctic Economic Council, we're sort of championing economic development in the Arctic. So to us, what we've found in the past, that's been our biggest challenge, is the lack of information. And due to the lack of information, there are all these misconceptions, misunderstandings out there. We can see as of last year, the Arctic Shipping Pledge, which Nike and other mega companies signed up for, where they promise never to transport any goods through the Arctic, even though it would have a less impact on the environment doing that than during the traditional routes. We also see this year that the mega banks, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, and others, they signed up for a pledge that they will not do any mining or mineral extractions in the Arctic. So when we at the Arctic Economic Council are trying to have a, let's say, real discussion with these people, we really need tangible information. And as you put it forward, it's highly accessible. I believe we can really hook it up with chambers of commerce in all the Arctic countries. In Scandinavia, you have Invest in Iceland, Invest in Norway. These are sort of semi-official entities. They can help out and with updating. It's certainly in their interest to update and have as accurate information as possible out there. So to me, just in short, you know, many people outside the Arctic do not understand that there are 4 million people living. It's a regulated and very, let's say, prosperous area with a promising future. There is no area in the world which has a better track record of being economically responsible and sustainable. So it should come, therefore, naturally that we develop this area further than any other area, because the track record is there. Mead just mentioned earlier the important work. Of course, he started out with infrastructure inventory and along with Scott and others, but the Arctic Investment Protocol. So, because I just want to make the point, you know, why is it important to have a protocol, a pan-Arctic protocol? I think it's of great importance because the reason why the Arctic has been developed in such a sustainable manner over the last millennia and centuries is really because all the investments, all the developments have been done by the locals. And the locals are so responsible with their own environment. So one might argue that newcomers would or could be less responsible. So that's why we see it so important to have the Arctic Investment Protocol to bring the Arctic standard to all infrastructure investments taking place in the Arctic. So those are my first few comments. Thank you.
Haider, thank you. I made some notes here to follow up with you because I think you obviously have raised 3 particularly important questions, and I'd like to circle back with you after Alice speaks, but I'd like to revisit with you the protocol. I'd also like to revisit with you the messaging to the rest of the world about investments in the Arctic, and then also how we work together to better inform not just outside of the Arctic, but even within the Arctic, there are misconceptions about infrastructure needs and investments in the Arctic. So thank you very much. Alice Rogoff, let me invite you, Alice, to this discussion. And thank you for joining us. As many of you know, Alice is the co-chair of the Polar Institute and the publisher of Arctic Today, and has certainly been a champion of Arctic infrastructure and investment in the North, and has spent a good part of the last year, perhaps, traveling the North and trying to instill at least a sense of confidence in the North, but also discovering what the North has to offer. So Alice, from your unique perspective, I would ask you as well, what do you think are some of the challenges we collectively have here in terms of economic development in the Arctic? And what are some of the things that you would like to actually see done, actionable items, actionable efforts, either from within the North or outside the North to enhance the North?
Well, first of all, thank you for all you guys have done to put this inventory into what can be called now a living form. It's going to be a tremendous addition to the conversation. But on that point about conversation, I think Haidar just really hit the nail on the head. And I'd like to pick up on the point he just made about the Arctic having been isolated in terms of its self-sufficiency and development. That has been both a blessing and a curse. And going forward, I think what that points out to us is, yes, there is a tremendous need for considering and adhering to the principles articulated in that Arctic Investment Protocol. At the same time, the Arctic is suffering from what I would call a capital drought. And I know that Hadar in his business life has been a part of the same ecosystem that I'm referring to. There are some tremendous opportunities for investment in the Arctic, many of which are reflected in this inventory of projects. At the same time, there are very few international financial organizations of any kind, from private to government to all the hybrids in between, who have taken the time or have people on the ground who know the kinds of things that Hadar knows about how they might be successful in their investing lives. And so I'll leave the point there, but I think that that's what those of us who now own the inventory, so to speak, have to wrestle with, is how do we translate this extraordinarily comprehensive database into something that that results in real tangible economic development led by people on the ground and their priorities.
Thank you, Alice. Hadar, let me follow up then on that, on, well, both of your thoughts here. You know, it seems that capital will be attracted if they think that there's a return on investment. They're very sophisticated organizations. They don't lose money for a living. Most often they're looking to make money. And so, you know, no matter how much we talk about the opportunities of the North, there's always this question about, are we not communicating the right way? Is capital easier? Is the flow easier elsewhere in the world, and return on investments better in other parts of the world versus the Arctic? Or are we still really a boutique investment area? I mean, when I think about, you know, statements made about the trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline that could be invested in the North, the question is, where is the push-pull here? How do we better communicate that by programs like this? But also, I mean, industry does its own research. So my question is, you know, what are they missing about the North that we need to amplify?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Alice, for your excellent remarks. As we are a living example of here in Iceland, our country industrialized the latest in Europe, and it was only when we got international knowledge transferred into our shipping industry, and then investments into our shipping industry, which led to the development of a highly efficient fishing industry, which we more or less picked up from Scotland. From Scottish industries that set base here and Norwegian industries. And there's this transfer of knowledge and this that comes with capital also that needs to be addressed. That you have these, let's say, smaller communities which are very sort of relying on one or two industries, and they need to diversify to keep on the young people inside the communities. They need to offer more diverse opportunities. So it all goes hands in hand. And what you mentioned earlier, you know, how do we bring the message across? What has been the obstacle? To start with, it's information. Because international investors say 4 million people scattered over, you know, how many thousands of square miles, you know, how are we going to make any good business out of it? But the infrastructure is big capital tickets. So, and the returns there are favorable. Because if we look towards what the world desperately needs going forward, it's better transport links, for data cables, for data transport, but also for general old-fashioned shipping. And then we also need cleaner energy. Elon Musk was opening a factory in Germany this morning, And he said that the electrical power production in the world would need to double just in the next 2 decades. So how do you do that? How do you get these resources? We have ample stranded power in the Arctic that we can bring online that helps everyone that is living on this planet. So we need, by bringing out the right information, we need to get people to see the whole picture. But unfortunately, there are some groups which are trying to blur and confuse this message, saying that Arctic shipping is horrible, saying that Arctic mining and extraction of minerals, which has the best track record in the world, should not continue. And so, but we have the right data. And as we were touching upon earlier, what could bring capital in there? It's basically better information. So if we are able to link this database into, let's say, government managed, like Invest in Iceland, Invest in Sweden, and Invest in Canada entities, this becomes the standard. This becomes what people will look to. So I see that as a very important step going forward.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent insight. Alice.
Mike Haydar again has made an excellent point that I think at least those of us in the US don't think about often enough. In the social democratic countries, and I would really put Iceland in that category, there is a different role played by government with respect to promoting investment and economic development than there is in the US. And I don't know if that's something that's permanent or not. But those groups like Invest in Iceland, like Nora Nova in Northern Norway, even like Greenland Invest, which is a co-investment entity, they have a very dedicated and clear mission to make investments happen in their countries that we don't have in the US. And I think that this is something that, Haydar, you at your remaining months at the Arctic Economic Council could perhaps help with, in terms of your mouthpiece function, for lack of a better term. If this inventory and all the conversation that goes with it could be fed into all of those groups such that we could have an ecosystem of talking about the investment opportunities in the Arctic, I think that would be a big step forward, because there is a private sector out there that we need to get interested, but we forget that we have these in-between entities like Invest in Iceland that can help be mouthpieces to the private sector. And we just have to work with every form of communication we know how to make this of interest. Yes, there are tremendous investment returns possible in these Arctic projects, but until we can find centers of capital that are willing to believe it, we won't get them to put their money where the money should go. So I'll leave the point there, but thank you again for making that link.
And thank you both. I wrote down a couple of things here. One is, when we started this discussion, it was, and it's good because it's the foundation, the infrastructure inventory. Okay, it's a list of projects. It will be interactive. It will be enhanced. It will have more utility over time. But that's just one component. The second is, you both used, in different terms, sort of these enzymes to spur economic development. So we're talking about, what are the enzymes? What are the drivers to drive wise economic development and infrastructure development? Who's in that enzyme pool? It sounds like it's a public-private partnership relationship where it makes sense. Also, you talked about clarifying the Arctic for many people. I mean, people still are looking for it on the map, but qualifying the way in which we talk about the Arctic. We have to demonstrate that there is viable investment opportunities in the Arctic, and also reflecting back on what the community's needs are that are local to that particular effort. So I like all of those. It's helping to shape, I think, I've made notes here, it's going to help shape at least some of the programs, but also some of the efforts and research we will do. And this dialogue has already influenced, at least in my mind, Jack, I don't know about your mind, it at least has influenced some other ideas for this project as it relates to the very issues that both Alice and Hitter have brought up. So I want to thank you both for doing exactly what we'd hoped you would do, which is to give us insight, to give us some guidance and leadership, and also to give us some ground truthing. Uh, Again, if this is just an academic exercise, we have failed. If it provides advancement of the effort and the narrative and reflects the needs of the community while bringing back good return on investment, a little, the effort for the entire Arctic. So I want to thank you both very much for setting up the next, not only providing this input, for setting up the next part of this conversation. So once again, thank you very much. Jack, now let me turn it.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thank you again, Alice and Hyder, for your comments and obviously your support as well. Alice for the Polar Institute and Hyder is a partner of the Wilson Centers and Polar Institute for the Arctic Economic Council. It's been helpful and insightful to have your contributions over the last year. Moving on to the next speaker is Mr. James P. DeHart's U.S. Coordinator for the Arctic region of the U.S. Department of State. He will speak about U.S. interests in and support of Arctic infrastructure as a solo presentation. So Mr. DeHart, over to you.
Jack, thanks very much. And Mike, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and join in the discussion and hear the speakers so far. First, congratulations on launching this new comprehensive inventory. So that's great. And my appreciation as well to all those who've had a hand in creating this over the years, because I know there have been more. And I think it's great that it's being made available to policymakers, to industry, to local communities, researchers, basically everybody, and in that way meets all of our interest in transparency, which is, of course, one of the key operating principles for the United States government as we look at the Arctic region. So infrastructure across the region obviously has great importance and implications for national security, and obviously great importance to local communities, Native communities around the region, to the well-being of those who call the Arctic their home, and including our fellow citizens in the state of Alaska. And of course, we consider Alaska to be a great partner in what we do across the region and with other governments across the region. And if we want to protect vital infrastructure, and if we want to grow new infrastructure that has benefits, then of course we need to know where the gaps are and where the opportunities exist. And I think that this inventory contributes a great deal to that. And I think it's even more important when we look at the physical and the environmental changes that are happening in a dramatic fashion and will lead to the Arctic becoming a much busier place, maybe not tomorrow or next week, but certainly in the years and decades ahead. And I think as the Arctic becomes busier, this will be for better or it will be for worse. And we need to strive and do all we can to ensure it's for the better. So I'm intrigued listening to the conversation here today, the genesis of the inventory, the connection to the Arctic Investment Protocol that was developed originally in the context of the World Economic Forum and then adopted by the Arctic Economic Council, and as I understand it, now being operationalized. And I'm convinced that this broader effort to guide responsible development across the region development that benefits local communities, native communities, and guards against substandard investment is a really important one, and that operationalizing the investment protocol is a growth area, I think, when we think about our multilateral approach in the Arctic region, when we think about our work through the Arctic Council and the Economic Council. So I'll tell everybody who's joining this now that if you'd like to have more of a conversation about that and how to operationalize it to the benefit of people living in the Arctic and the governments, then I'm all for that, and I'm prepared to have that conversation. So if you let me shift gears just a little bit and be maybe a little bit corny, I don't know how many of you still have vinyl records. Jack has probably switched to Spotify. Some of you, okay, good. I'm glad to see him shake his head. But anybody who has vinyl knows that there's a side A and a side B. And you might think of side A as the safeguards that we put in place to guard against substandard investment, to guard against investment that ignores the local workforce, that contains debt traps, or ignores environmental requirements. And side A is really important, but you also need side B. And so you need you need to flip it over, and you need the music of sustainable financing and advocacy for commercial engagement, and the kind of investment that brings real benefits to local communities, and which in a lot of remote areas people are desperate to have. So we need we need the entire piece of vinyl here. I think that the Arctic infrastructure inventory has both sides and accomplishes that. And because it's all about transparency, I think it contributes then to both accountability as well as to opportunity. So for that reason, I'm happy to be here to help launch it, and appreciate this effort and congratulate you again for this launch. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. DeHart. I would just like to note to the attendees that the Q&A session will occur later on in this event for all of these sessions. But at this point, I believe Mike Sfriga has a quick follow-up question for you, Mr. DeHart. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. Sorry about that. We're calling an audible here at the moment. Jim, you noted the protocol, and I would just like to just follow up on that. I think you hit upon something here that we talked about a year ago, but you amplified it, which is when we talk with higher in leadership at the Arctic Economic Council, our vision was not just for this infrastructure inventory. Our idea was to merge these two things, the protocol and all that is in it, because it is rich, and this tool. So I would accept the challenge and would like to work on how we, together with other partners, advance these together. If one goes down the road without the other, I don't know that we get the full benefit. So I would just like to say that we would welcome the opportunity to help advance that discussion. Appreciate your comments. Jack, back over to you, and thank you for allowing that audible to happen, and really appreciate the shout out to Vinyl Record.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Moving on to the next session of today's event, we will have two speakers, Sherry Goodman, a senior fellow with the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center and a senior fellow with our Environmental Change and Security program as well at the Wilson Center, will facilitate today's discussion. And Gail Schubert, President and CEO of Bering Straits Native Corporation, will participate as well, about local, regional, and national perspectives on sustainable Arctic infrastructure in the context of the inventory. So Sherry, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, Mike, and all the speakers here today. First, let me thank Jack, you and your excellent team for bringing us to this point. It's really an enormous piece of work, and you really have shown your chops with putting this all together and bringing it together. So congratulations to you. I hope your mom is watching. Okay, shout out to Jack and the team. From another mom who's very proud of all the kids we're growing up here at the Wilson Polar Institute and across the Wilson Center. And then to all my colleagues who are here on the, Mead and Alice and Hayder, and of course, Gail and Jim, Ambassador. Thank you all for your leadership in all that you do, all the support you provide to the Wilson Center, but your leadership, of course, across many years in many different dimensions. And that have enabled us to get to this point and where we can talk about both the breadth and the depth of this Arctic infrastructure inventory, and more specifically today in this section about how it can be used for sustainable development of the infrastructure at the local, regional, and national, or I'm going to say the national security perspective. I'd really like to start with Gail, who is there in the Bering Strait Corporation. Gail, I'm sorry we can't be together except by Zoom, but I remember fondly our meetings our recent meetings up in Alaska over the last several years, and your great depth and knowledge and experience about how this inventory might full in developing sustainable Arctic infrastructure, particularly in the Bering Strait region that you have management leadership for and with which you're intimately familiar. So I'd like to sort of give you the floor for a couple minutes and talk about how you see this helping in the development of sustainable Arctic infrastructure, either both in the Bering Strait region particularly, or more broadly across the Arctic.
Thank you, Sherry. I'd like to start out by acknowledging what I think everyone knows already, and that is that there's really very little infrastructure in Arctic Alaska. We have the Red Dog mine up in the Nana region. We have the oil and gas development up on Alaska's North Slope. That really kind of summarizes the real infrastructure. I did a really quick look through in terms of what some of the other communities generally have. We all have either airports or seaports in most of the communities. In terms of what feeds our economy, fish, of course, is really critically important. You all know that the fish species are moving north, and that I think resulted in an incident that you're probably all aware of, which was the Russian incursion into the Alaska fishing fleet in international waters, which was a pretty interesting event to have happened. In our communities, water and sewer facilities really remain a top priority, and that is something that the villages really need because of health issues and concerns. They would also help to support the fisheries businesses in our communities and support local job growth, which we think is really critically important. One of the things that the Corps of Engineers has invested in a number of projects in the region. One of them is in my hometown of Yunlakleet, where 10 years ago they spent more than $28 million on shoring up our beach and building a gabion wall around the village to protect the infrastructure there. A lot of our communities are facing and are imminently threatened by flooding and erosion. And in our community of Shishmaref, for example, that community is in dire need of protection, and it's a community that is in peril because erosion from storms this season alone have drastically encroached on the airport access road, potentially cutting the village off to their only link to the outside world. One of our communities in the region annually builds a sand barrier in the fall to try to help protect the community from flooding and erosion. And I think that the one thing that we really need to have is we need to have real investment in the Arctic to support these communities. You know, we have a $68 billion permanent fund, which was, I think, originally intended to be a rainy day fund. Mead probably knows more about that than I do, but you know, it's not just raining here, it's storming here in Alaska. And, you know, I think that we really need to start to look inward to supporting our own growth, sustainment, infrastructure, and the permanent fund, I think, certainly is one of the funds that could be utilized for that. The pension fund, which I served on for a number of years, has a somewhat more restricted purpose that it could be utilized for. We're excited about Nome's potential port expansion, and that's something that we are really looking forward to. It's something that is needed. The communities, the Nome supports a number of communities in the region in terms of bringing freight and other goods and services into the region that then are delivered to the outlying communities. We recently finally had Port Clarence transferred to us. It's a natural deep water harbor. It was a former Loran station, and given the recent transfer, we're looking at ways that we can try to help make that an important part of the Arctic safety, and because of the fact that it has a protected deep water harbor, we do have some anchors that when Shell exited the Arctic, they gave to us, and we're looking at having those anchors set this coming season, and that would provide vessels with some degree of protection if there are Arctic storms and that sort of thing, where they have to come in and anchor up there. And there are other comments that I could make in response to questions that people may have. So I'll just stop my comments there for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail. And I'm just going to pick up on your comment first on Shishmaref, because I recall it's over 20 years ago now when I served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And we, with the Navy, were trying to work on how we already knew about the problems of erosion at Shishmaref. And we were trying to see what we could do with DOD, the Navy funds, because of the naval facility there, to address those issues that were both affecting the military activities, but more deeply affecting, of course, the local community, and how to leverage that. And that is an example, I think, of a perennial challenge that we have in defense infrastructure, which I think is why I'm so excited about this Arctic infrastructure inventory, because as you well know, and most of you listening in, we have, of course, military and defense facilities across Alaska, across the US, and many of them, while they're not in this inventory, they are adjacent in many cases to the types of civilian infrastructure listed in this inventory. And when we come to talking about how to make infrastructure sustainable for the future in the climate era, we need to be accounting for the changing climate and how it's affecting all the infrastructure, whether it's permafrost, thaw, sea level rise, erosion, and many, many other factors. And, the Department of Defense has recently developed a new climate assessment tool, which it is now using on over 150 military bases, as plans to, that will be used, including at some of its bases in Alaska. And I think this could be a very, very valuable to be able to use this civilian Arctic infrastructure inventory in conjunction with the work that the Department of Defense will be doing in coming years to improve the sustainability of the joint infrastructure. And as you well know, and many of you know, of course, when you're doing anything in Alaska, it's always joint. It's joint, federal, local, regional, civilian, national security, civilian. And so we have to think of this as an integrated whole, a whole of government approach that also helps us provide, in my view, I think this inventory provides us additional sort of domain awareness about what infrastructure is there and what's not there. As you noted, Gail, there's not a lot there in many cases. And so we need to know that too. Because as former Secretary of Defense said, we need to up our game in the Arctic. So when we're thinking about how to do that, it's a whole of society, a whole of Arctic approach. And so I think that transparency that we'll have with this increase with the inventory will help us enable us to make better decisions in the future in order to provide for resilient Arctic infrastructure. So let me ask you, I have to see how much time we have left for our discussion here. So we're going to have a few more minutes. So when you think about what roles can you talk about the roles Alaskan Native corporations play in developing and investing in Arctic infrastructure and how they can partner with the federal government to leverage financial resources to realize priority infrastructure needs, and how this inventory will be helpful in that regard?
So I'm going to speak just for Bering Straits itself. We are owned by about 7,000 shareholders and shareholder descendants, and we have an obligation to those shareholders to ensure that when we make investments, that they are investments that provide good value to Bering Straits and allow us to continue to support the kinds of programs that we currently support for our shareholders. Increased dividends, elder distributions, scholarships, which is probably one of the highlights in terms of what we do, in my opinion. And then many other kinds of benefits, death benefits, and that sort of thing to our shareholders. In terms of investing or co-investing in infrastructure development in our region, we don't really have the kinds of natural resources that would promote that. It's like Nanai has, as I said, the Red Dog Mine, and the North Slope has oil and gas resources. So in terms of making a co-investment, it's clear that there are needs in our region. The Nome Port, for example, is something that is really critically needed. And that would really, I think, I know that they are working with the Corps of Engineers in terms of, and the government in terms of getting funding for that. So that's a critical need. In terms of Bering Straits, we have, as I said, Port Clarence, and we are interested in contributing to the degree that we can to the safety and security of the region in terms of shipping and transportation. And so because of that, we are looking at setting the anchors that we received from Shell. I think that it would be great if we had a lot of natural resources and things that we could do to help develop the region more economically. But we do what we can with what we have, and we'll continue to do that.
So Gail, thank you so much. That's very insightful. Obviously, each Alaskan Native corporation is different in terms of its resources and its geography and its membership. So let's, talking about the Bering Strait, which separates Alaska from Russia, and where, as you noted, there's increased human activity and navigation, and likely will be more so in coming years as waters warm and temperature rises. And how can this inventory be helpful in efforts you would think about to improve safety and security across the Bering Straits region as you think about that increased navigability of the area, and then of course the increased risks of an accident? You mentioned those anchors, which seems like a very smart, safety decision, right? Safe harbor, deal with, so and then there's infrastructure obviously on the Russian side too. So give us a view from your region about how this might, how you could see it usefully evolving in coming years with that increased Bering Strait traffic.
Well, I think that first and foremost, we need to ensure that as traffic continues to increase, because it will continue to increase through the Bering Strait. You mentioned the Russian side. They had a tremendous build out of military infrastructure in the Arctic because they really want to ensure that they either control or benefit from the increased traffic through the Arctic. I was talking to someone from home the other day, and the water was still open. So no, the ice hadn't come in yet or frozen over yet. And even in Yunlakleet, where typically people would be out ice fishing, a month or so ago, they had to wait until fairly recently to go out ice fishing. So food security is something that is important as well. I think that in terms of the infrastructure that is placed into the Arctic, first it's important to support the existing industries that really create the need and the opportunity for traffic through the Bering Strait. The Red Dog mine, of course, has it ships zinc out, and on Alaska's North Slope, oil and gas development has been under pressure. It's one of our, it really is the industry that I think kind of saved Alaska from falling off the cliff. And we need to support the continued development of oil and gas on the North Slope. That's, there are areas and regions where that was carved out specifically for that purpose. We can't allow or shouldn't allow outside groups to come in and tell us what we can and can't do. So, I think it's interregionally, it's important to support the other regions in terms of the kinds of economic development opportunities that they have, that maybe we don't have the same kinds of opportunities, but we need to ensure that those opportunities that exist are supported and carried through. And I think that by doing that, it will result in increased traffic that could tangentially benefit us through the Nome port and other ports or structures that might be built out in the Bering Strait region.
Thank you, Gail. I'm asking, should we? I see everyone else back on the line. Do you want Jack? Are we going to Q&A, or you want us to continue the dialogue here?
So let's go over to the Q&A now. We've received several questions via the Polar Institute email. So do you have any final comments, Sherry and Gail, before we switch over to Q&A?
I just say, I'm excited about this because, as I said, I think there's the transparency it affords, the domain awareness, and the ability to use it as we develop more resilient solutions for infrastructure across the Arctic, and as we look at more constructive engagement with allies and partners across the Arctic. That also should be evidence-based, and this is evidence, and it gives you one of the tools, a constructive tool for engagement. So I'm excited about it for all those and multiple other reasons.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Gail, for your comments in today's event. So moving on to the Q&A session, we've got several about the inventory itself, about some content related to Arctic economic development. But once again, from our team, Mike Sfraga wants to ask a question first. So Mike, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. I'll make it very quick. As you have noticed, Jack and I are working the emails that are coming in and our cell phones from colleagues around the North texting us with questions, bypassing the email. The first one that I have about 4 or 5 texts on is for Jim DeHart. Jim, you noted the protocol. I thought that might get some reaction. So to boil down the number of questions, I'll just aggregate it into a sentence. How do you envision moving that forward from your position? What kind of things could you do to help advance the protocol and sort of integrate it into a lot of the work of the U.S. in the Arctic?
Mike, thanks. It's a challenging question. And I think part of it is that, it's up to governments to make the key decisions on investment in their countries. And I think we've seen throughout the region and more broadly, governments take important steps to establish investment screening mechanisms, measures along those lines, so that they're doing side A of the record of safeguarding. And of course, great interest in our government in seeing what we can do to stoke up interest by U.S. commercial entities to get more invested, more involved in the region. And those are all important steps. But I think that we have a fairly open question of how to tie those efforts together regionally more strongly. I'm convinced that this has to be an effort in the Arctic Council. I'd like to have further discussions on what steps the Arctic Economic Council is taking, including through the infrastructure working group to operationalize this. And then I think, really importantly, there's got to be more discussion connecting to Native communities, to local communities across the region, and think about how we pursue this in a spirit of partnership, and not just at the national level, but at the subnational level as well. So those are some of my thoughts, but I think, I think this is an area where we need some brain power and some focus and some coordinated effort to come up with some good regional solutions.
Thank you, Jim.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Jim. So getting to more questions about the inventory, we have a question from Gavin Piercy of the U.S. State Department about the inventory itself and one of the features of it, so I'll quickly answer that. He asked whether it's possible to filter projects by funding source, such as public versus private, origin country of investment, and filtering by ownership as well. So Gavin, to answer your question, as of now, we don't have that ability, but that's certainly important information to include in the filter and something that we should prioritize in the next iteration of our inventory. So thank you for the feedback, and we'll integrate it. Moving on to the next question from Benjamin Sachs of Rand Corporation. I'll pose this question to both Mead and Hyder, but before posing it, I'll just a quick response to it as well. The question is, what geographical locations are most popular for potential Arctic development? Are there any clusters or patterns that we see? Real quick, regarding the inventory itself, of the current 8,000 or so entries, about 1,900 are in Norway, about 1,800 each in Russia and Sweden, and about 1,200 in Finland. So with that said, this is based on our first round of research. Those numbers and those percentages trend may very well change as we add more projects to the inventory moving forward. But back to the question itself, Mead and Hyder, do you have any comments on any clusters or popular locations for potential Arctic development?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Just real fast, I want to respond to this question as well as the one on sources that was asked just before this. one of the questions about sources really is it's a matter of policy argument of whether too much money is coming in from China, for example, that has come up several times in several different Arctic countries. And then Hyder, myself, Alice, Scott, Gail have all worked on ways to bring more new financial institutions to the Arctic. Not only do we have to, interest the existing ones, but help create new mechanisms. And so doing the sources will help track this. In terms of where the projects are, I think you'll find that we're seeing one. I bet you they track with population. When we looked at investment in private equity in the least populated areas, it was really hard to find a diversity enough of economic activity sometimes to make private equity work, and that works more where there's a greater population, where there's big anchor projects like Prudhoe Bay, like Red Dog, like Norilsk Zinc. You're likely to find other infrastructure that comes along. So I don't have a specific answer on where the clusters are, but as somebody whose job was to go look for investment across the Arctic, it more often than not tied with population.
Yeah, maybe, excellent comments, Meet. And of course, Russia is 40% of the geography of the Arctic, of the land mass. But then, just as Meet was saying, infrastructure follows other infrastructure. So if you have like a big mine, we can look to Yamal, where they have this huge LNG port in northern Russia. That was an investment of $27 billion. But once they built the port and the airport, Yamal 2 becomes much more easy to build because the critical infrastructure is in place. And once they built that, they will also build sort of power plants, now LNG power plants, and then they can build factories. And then with the factories, so this sort of mushrooms. And we can see that in Greenland, in Iceland, where they've found resources, mostly natural resources to use, that brings enough capital to sort of, let's say, break the ice, to connect this in a proper way with international markets. And so you need something, let's say, a big investment to break the ice. But then once that's been done, all kinds of investments follow. We can look to the airport here in Iceland, which was a NATO project built by the US. And since then, we've become a tourist attraction because it sort of built the critical infrastructure and offered then new opportunities. But I very much agree with what Meet was saying. This follows geography and population.
Great. Thanks, Meet and Hyder. Meet, do you have something else to add, or? I guess not. Okay. Moving on to the next question from Antonia Chambers, formerly of the U.S. State Department and Arctic Economic Analysis. I'd like to pose this to Gail. What can be, and obviously anyone else that wants to comment on these questions are welcome to do so as well. What can be done to counteract the false narratives that all Arctic transit and development is harmful? This narrative may discourage investment in the region. So Gail, would you like to take a first stab at that answer?
Gail, I think you're on mute.
Great. Okay, sorry about that. So, when I think that when people think of the Arctic, they think of pristine nature with reindeer running around and grazing in peaceful settings and that sort of thing. They forget that there are people here that rely on obviously development and commerce to support our lifestyles, and that without that, we really would not be able to do the kinds of things that we do. And so while, people may have different ideas in terms of what we should and should not do, I think that we always have to act in the best interest of the state and our people in terms of pushing development and other things that we do and have it move forward.
Great, thanks, Gail. Any other comments from some of the panelists before we move on to the next question?
Jack, this is the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. It was a document done in 2009 by the 8 Arctic nations, where 8 nations agreed on a blueprint for marine safety in the Arctic. And marine safety includes sustainability, supporting sea hunters, biodiversity, and so forth. We've made probably more progress on that agenda in the Arctic Council than any other subject. Okay, with the oil spill agreement, with the search and rescue agreement, with the mandatory polar code, with the Bering Straits agreement. There's a measure in Congress right now to set up an advisory committee to get the U.S. Moving forward more on financing capabilities for Arctic shipping. And I'll just say this, I've been accused and others have been accused of pushing this as part of a pro-climate change agenda, which could not be further from the truth. This ocean is accessible to the entire world. And if we in the Arctic don't take the responsibility to make sure it's done right, we're going to be the sorriest. So the fact is that there are climate improvements from shorter shipping routes. There are resources that will come to market because shipping is available. And I think we should be very proud of what we're doing in the Arctic and not let this criticism dampen out of ignorance.
Great. Thanks, May. That's a good point. So I think we've got time for one final question before we wrap up for today. I'll pose this to all of the panelists. It's from John Farrell, Executive Director of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. He states that only a few academic economists from the U.S. focus on Arctic economics. How can they use this inventory?
Well, being an economist myself, maybe I'll start. Development and economic growth has always been a challenge in academia for economists for whatever reason, because it's such a foundation. And it's only until Barrow came and started in the early 90s, late 80s, focusing on what is the fundament of economic growth that this really started developing within economic theory. So I think this is actually a fantastic base to use, this database, to see what really spurs economic growth and how it trickles down and how it develops and how it interplays with other, let's say, neighboring countries or other and between industries. So I think this is for economists which are looking into development and economic growth, this is a fantastic way to start.
I'm going to suggest, John, and thank you for your question. First off is the Arctic Research Commission itself makes up the U.S. goals and agenda. I think urging people to pay attention to this makes sense. The improvements that we're talking about this is clearly a piece of Arctic research that will be used by policymakers, whether it's the CFIUS people over at Treasury or the World Bank people or people who are working on energy and transportation policy, rural policy, Alaska Native investment policy. There's going to be a lot of use of this database. The second is work on ways to improve it, because as Heider said, the economists will actually gain from this. One thing I would point out is that as we got this started, we've been watching a program at Arctic 360 in Toronto, which is trying to get better information on the economic cash flows in the Arctic at the same time. And it may be that these two kinds of work give us a better picture of the economic development questions. Every Arctic region I know is in a period of transition, either because of COVID, which has gut-shot tourism as an example, and energy prices and climate policies. And I just have to say, having good economic information is going to be very important for this. It will help you set a research agenda.
And if I could just add, I think that we now have the ingredients for a really exciting program that we should organize at Arctic Circle next fall and probably Arctic Frontiers beyond that. We'll all be able to be in person again, God willing, and hopefully we can have practitioners from many fields, public, private, academic, and research, all there to put our heads together. So thank you, Jack, for giving us the material that we can carry forward and bring to more fulsome life.
Thank you, Alice. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. We've gone through 90 minutes again very quickly. When we first started working on these programs, we started with 45 minutes and then expanded them to 60 and then 90. And I think we're going to have to go to 2 hours because there's just, you just can't get to everything that you'd like to talk about, or we'll at least do a series of these. And in fact, our plan is to do a series of these types of programs. Alice, we take you up on that challenge to participate in the Arctic Circle Assembly, Arctic Frontiers, Arctic Futures. I think there's lots of work for all of us to do, and I think if you're interested in the Arctic, you're our partners, so that's all good. I want to thank you all for, Jack, you and your team have taken what was an Excel spreadsheet. I cannot overstate this. It was an Excel spreadsheet, a rich, wonderful spreadsheet, and you have created a living resource for the Arctic community, or those who are interested in the Arctic, have equity in the Arctic, would like to see a future for the Arctic. So thank you and your team for doing that, because you gave us from paper to action, as Alice likes to say, and now it's up to us to carry forward it. So thank you to all of you. Sherry, thank you for leading that discussion, being a part of that discussion. I like the fact that we brought in from the big sort of circumpolar issues, the broad international issues and the security issues and sustainable infrastructure down to the community level and what it means to the community. So Gail, thank you for giving us a reality check on the ground, what's really happening, at least this part of Alaska. Alice, for your work, not just in helping to create our Polar Institute, but in seeding enzymes all over with all of the different programs, whether it be at Harvard, or with Dwayne in London or elsewhere. If you look about the Arctic, you will find Alice Rogoff there being a champion. So Alice, thank you. How do your leadership at AEC, instrumental, and Taro before in situating that organization critically for the future of the North. And we are really happy to be a part of anything that goes forward with the Arctic Economic Council. To Jim DeHart, Jim, thank you. I know that you have been very active in trying to advance the portfolio of the US in the Arctic from your particular position. And we thank you for always responding to our request to come and speak with us. It's important that we hear from you, and it's important that we have this dialogue with you. Mead, I don't know what else to say aside from what others have said. You've been an early champion of the Arctic writ large, not just Alaska. You've used Alaska as a fulcrum, but thank you very much for always participating in these, but also giving us some really critical history, but also a vision forward. Michaela Stith, Michaela, thank you. She's off screen, but thank you for advancing always our programs in such a professional way and making them all work and seem like there's not a lot of effort, but there is. And finally, to those that are watching, what you have seen here is the very first phase of a more ambitious program with senior fellows, with programs and symposia, with research that Hyder responded to and Jack asked about, hopefully a reach out to the economists and the professors at different institutions around the globe to do more research on this issue of economic development in the Arctic. And what you have seen is an incomplete program and project that we will continue to make better, but it will never hopefully be complete because we will still try to improve this as we go forward. So I want to thank you all for the input that you have for us as we try to make this better. So thank you everyone for joining us, at least this morning in Alaska, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you might be watching from, and from the participation from those in attendance. Thank you all, and have a very good morning, afternoon, or a good evening. Thank you all.